Hey, what's up guys, Zach with Wire Customs, and today we're assembling our 47 Ford transmission. Alright guys, I want to show you two different style gear sets here. The easiest way to tell them apart is how the tangs are on the top. This one takes a cutout tang for the thrust washer. Then this style takes these notches on the thrust washer that locks it in place. And these are usually found on light duty trucks, so the open drive transmissions and F1s is what I normally see these in. These are usually the car passenger side thrust washers. When you get the rebuild kits, they come with both thrust washers. So when you get that kit, don't get confused thinking, where does this washer go? I'm worried that I'm not using all the parts on the kit. That's because the kits are basic and they come for both style of gear sets. So this is the one that we're using in this one from the 47. And we won't need that new thrust washer, but we will need this one. So I'm going to apologize for this being a little bit harder to see. It's hard to hold the camera, I'm only on here, and also show the inside of the transmission at the same time. But I'm going to do my best to explain everything as articulate as I can. So the first thing I'm going to do is put the counter shaft in. Make sure you put your thrust washers in first. So let's see if you can see this. I have my thrust washer in there right here. So I'm going to grab the light so you can see better. Okay, so I got my thrust washer right here already in there. I put my transmission assembly grease on it and stuck it on there so it's sticking inside, holding in place. Now I'm going to go ahead and put the counter shaft in and just set it down. I'm not going to slide our shaft in it yet and hold it officially in place, because you can't get the input shaft and the output shaft in with that actually in place in the case. It just has to sit on the bottom until you have it all assembled. Then you throw on that last. Now I'm also going to grease the inside of this really well before I set it in there. And I need to install the bearing. I just had this thrust washer on here so you can see which one is which. So I'm going to get my assembly lube, put this in here. We're going to have this shaft here that separates the two bearings. Now I like to grease these up really well on the inside and out. It makes the assembly easier when we get to that stage. So I already have that pre-lubricated. And I also have my bearings pre-packed, as packed as I could possibly get them. Set those to the side. And I'm just going to grease this up real quick. And we'll start the assembly. Now it doesn't hurt to have too much assembly grease. I use transmission assembly grease. It's very, very tacky. When it comes to assembling these transmissions, you want very tacky. You don't want to use a watery style. You don't want to use something that's thin, is what I mean. So these use 600 weight gear oil, really, really thick gear oil. You don't want to thin that out at all. Otherwise, these transmissions are extremely prone to leaking. So here's our little divider. I'm going to slide that in there. I'm going to slide in my pre-packed roller bearings. One for that side. One for this side. That should slide right in. Now this side is not a mating surface. Technically it doesn't need grease. It's not going to be moving around on itself. But I put grease on the thrust washer just so it'll stick itself in place. You know, kind of like a custard. It's not going to fall around on us while we're trying to put it inside the case and assemble everything. Now this big side here, that connects with the input shaft. So this bigger gear has to go forward. So this is the rear of the case that you can see from your vantage point, and I'm going to slide it down in there like that. We're also going to have alternative thrust washers that you're going to see like this. Some of the thrust washers, this will actually go against the back here on this side. So just be on the lookout of the type of setup that you have coming apart to make sure when you go back together you have the right setup. I'm going to slide this down in the case and let it rest completely on the bottom. And I'm going to try my dangest to not lose the thrust washer that's already stuck to the case. Alright, thrust washer's in the correct spot still. We're golden. There's very minimal slack or play in here. Check your play on everything that you install. it shouldn't be so tight you can't spin it freely and easily, and it shouldn't be so loose that you can feel play back and forth. There is a run out gauge. There is specifications for run out. Some guys turn their own thrust washers. That's not completely needed if you're just doing this at home inside your garage. But those are things to keep in mind in case you run into a unique situation that does occasionally happen on these cases. Now here's our reverse gear. It has a step on one side, no step on the other, or really, really small step, I guess. So take a good look at that. It can only go in one way. You can throw this in here and determine that by itself. Will it mesh or not mesh if I put it in like this? It's not meshing that way. I'm going to flip it around, and it is meshing that way. This step is the step that avoids the thrust washer on the back of the counter shaft. So this step has to go to the rear. I'm going to go ahead and install the pin that holds the reverse gear in. What I do is get the pin well lubed up, and I get the pin that holds those in. I slide it in and use it like a T-handle and just spin it in. Now when I slid that in, that left us with quite a bit of grease hanging off the back here. Make sure you clean that extra grease off really well. Later we're going to put RTV around that. Now I have seen guys get a step bit or a countersink and countersink these out just a tad to give a little bit more room or a little bit more of a shoulder to put silicone on these. I do think that's a good idea. A lot of these where these are extremely tight, I'm not worried about it. 600 weight oil is not going to come out of there. If you're slide in, just drop in really, really easily. You should probably think about countersinking the edge of the case slightly so the silicone has more place to bite and seal. Now I went ahead and also installed my pin to hold that reverse pin in, the reverse idler gear pin in, and that's going to keep it from falling out for the rest of the assembly, but we're going to have to pull it back out at the very end. Here's our input shaft. This is the old kind of like oil, I don't know, you want to call it oil baffle. It's kind of keeps the slosh from the oil from coming out from the input shaft. So I leave it on there until it's time for me to directly replace it. So I make sure I use the exact same one. Like I said, these rebuild kits come with a bunch of different stuff. So we got a step, it's very easy to identify. Then I got this style that comes in its own package. If you need the part number, here it is. Still a Ford licensed official part number. So now in your build kit, you're going to have two different sizes of these big roller bearings. We have a bigger size and a smaller size. The big bearing is for the input shaft. The small bearing is for the output shaft. Now these are roller bearings, but they're not greased and sealed roller bearings. These are old school. And if you look at them really close on yours and rebuilding it, you can actually see the ball bearings inside of it. These do need to be lubricated. Right before I put the shift tower back onto the case, I'm going to pour grease right here inside of these, and I'm going to spin the transmission around with these in it just to make sure they get good and greased. I do that at the very end. Keep that in mind. It's just for like initial driving. After you start driving, they grease themselves. So note that I might not have said out loud yet. The step in that baffle has to step down, so it's as close to that gear as possible. If you put this baffle in upside down, there's a gap between the gear and the baffle itself. That's wrong. That's what wrong looks like. Flip it around. The step has to go down so it's as close to the gear as possible. That's what the right way looks like. I'm not sure how well that looks on the camera, but in person, it'll make sense. There's my bearing and race heater. Got it from Harbor Freight like 10 years ago. It's done me well. Doesn't take very long. It needs to be too hot to touch with a bare hand. That's about it. It should slide right on. Slid right on. Piece of cake. Next, we're going to put the C-clip on. That's what's actually going to hold that in place. Here it is. And I'm going to wait for that to cool before I touch any of that. But the only thing that's left on this, push the C-clip on. Then we're going to grease the inside here where this bearing goes. We have one bearing left. This one goes in the input shaft. Pretty simple, just grease it real quick so it's not going to start out dry when you initial run. Now this is what connects into the input shaft. So that's the front, so hold it in whatever way helps you kind of identify which way is which. Is the second gear thrust washer. I know it looks like a symbol off of Star Wars, but it is a thrust washer. I'm going to lightly lubricate this. So here's our second gear. We're going to slide that on. The synchronizer ring up. So this is the synchronizer ring. I'm not going to grease the synchronizer ring. I am going to put oil all over it when it's all the way assembled. There it is. At this point, all this that's mating up is going to get greased. Now I'm going to put on our brand new brass synchronizer. Okay, here's our synchronizer block, our synchronizer hub. These do not come in the rebuild kit, and I always replace these. There's a lot of issues with these transmissions popping out of gear. One of the very few reasons why they pop out of gear is because either these springs are worn out or these tabs are worn out. There's also the other style where these tabs have a ball in the center. Those are just the earlier years. The later years they were stamped like this. I guess it saved money, but they all work the same. This transmission was missing one of these springs. So that goes to show how important these are. Really simple. These just sit in here. These are springs that hold them. It doesn't really hold them in place, but it does give them spring tension. So we're just going to slide this on here to make sure that the spring contacts each one to give it spring tension in and out. So that's what it kind of looks like. And we're also going to put the spring on the other side. And I try to do them the opposite. So this side, the spring is up. I'm going to flip it on the other side and put the spring up, just so they're in opposite directions, so we're getting really good spring tension on every spring. Now they came out with different detents, but they did not change the spring block. The other ones, a spring goes inside of that hole in the spring block, or in the synchronizer block. So just be mindful of that. You might have the earlier style, or you might have this style, but they work the same. Now these just sit in here, and their little bent over tabs keep them from sliding out of place. Really simple. So you're basically going to have to hold these in place as you slide it over the block. What I'm going to do is go ahead and grease this, because this is kind of an odd area for oil to get to. I don't want anything really important to be dry like this, so I'm going to grease it up just a little bit, and once you slide it in here, it'll throw itself around. Okay, so now I'm actually ready to assemble this and put it on the output shaft. These do have a front and back. This has a front and back. So we have a longer step here on this side. The other side's a shorter step. We have a shoulder on one side and not a shoulder on the other. Both steps go forward. Both steps go forward. I would call this a step. I would call this a step. Or you can call them shoulders. Both shoulders go forward. So as I assemble this, make sure they're matching with both shoulders forward. I'm going to go ahead and put my detents on. Enjoy this awesome, fun part. Whether I make this look easy or make this look hard, the struggle bus is real for all of us on this here. I'm going to squeeze these down with my Ninja Turtle grip, I guess, and slide it in place. Once you get about halfway in, they'll hold themselves. They won't shoot out on you. But they don't have that much spring tension that there's much to fight. There we go. And it just clipped in place beautifully. That's going to feel great when we're shifting it in gear. Both shoulders go forward. So now I can go ahead and slide this on. There's that side. I'm going to wipe off all the excess here, all my excess assembly lube. And I'm going to push the center down as far as it can go, because the center isn't actually going to slide. The block isn't going to slide. Just this outside piece is going to slide on the block itself. This actually spins in the forks, so when we go to actually install this, I'm going to put grease in here on the little fork area. There's a C-clip that goes on over this, so make sure the center is pushed down far enough that that C-clip fully engages. That's what we're going to put on next. Now if you have everything aligned correctly, it should shift in and out of gear just fine. So go ahead and bench test that to make sure yours acts like how mine is, sliding right into gear. Nice spring detent. spring detent back into a neutral position. Next, after that, something that commonly gets missed is this little spacer. They call it a lock ring, but it doesn't really lock anything in place. This is going to slide down like that. This is going to be a bearing surface here, so I'm going to put some of my assembly lube on that. And I went ahead and put my lock ring or my snap ring back onto the input shaft. So we're ready to put the bearing inside of there. Put a little grease on that too. Then here, there was two different lengths of these roller bearings. The shorter ones are in the counter shaft. The longer one is the input shaft bearing. So we're going to slide that in place. And not right now, but later, these two halves will meet, and that's how that works. The only thing we're missing here is our synchronizer. And I can go ahead and set that on there now, I guess. I didn't say it earlier. I did it without saying it out loud. These synchronizers have these cutouts in them. These cutouts have to land a certain way. So when it's on the synchronizer block, if you look at this, if you try it on yours in the garage, see how it actually fits down inside there. One way it won't fit, and if you spin it, it'll slide into where it actually will fit. Make sure you check out these cutouts on here, and when you're assembling it, you line it up with those detents because they sit inside the detents. Alright guys, so we're almost done. So we're going to go ahead and put our reverse gear on. This fork side goes to the back. So that's the direction the fork side needs to go to. I pre-greased it on the inside. It's got lubrication on it. So now that we have first reverse gear on, it's time to put our oil baffle on. It also has a step. This step is so it can sit closer to the gear. So sit it in there. So the step allows it to go closer to the gear. If it's upside down, that step will be further away from the gear. So put it on correctly. Now it's time to set this in the case. This is the rear. So we're going to set it in to the case in the rear just like this. Now it's just loosely sitting in there. Now it's going to help us for the next step. Since we have this already assembled, we're going to go ahead and slide this in. Make sure it goes into that input portion for the output shaft. So I'm going to line that up. Slide that on here. Then my brass synchronizer fell off. I'm going to slide that down into the synchronizer block and line that up with our tabs so it's in the correct place. And on this side of the case, that ring is on the outside. We have our input shaft bearing, that roller bearing I was showing you, that ring is going to be on the outside. Make sure that's pushed all the way in so that ring is holding up against the case. So I'm going to flip that around so you can see what I'm talking about. That ring here is sitting all the way against the shoulder. I'm going to go ahead and install my input shaft so this doesn't slide out on us. Now I'm going to go ahead and install the seal into our little input shaft cover here. This seal has a shoulder and it has a cavity. The cavity goes towards the inside. So it's probably impossible to show you what that looks like on the camera. But the rubber comes from one end. The cavity is the back. So just look at yours really closely and you'll see what I'm talking about. So I'm going to set mine in there. And I also put grease around the rubber. I always do that just so on the input shaft where it's spinning, just a little bit of extra grease to keep that rubber from burning up. And that should completely bottom out on the inside, so that's what that looks like, completely bottomed out. That's good to go. I'm going to put a little bit of grease on the inside in here just to keep it from rusting up. This in here shouldn't get much oil, or hopefully ever, because on here, this is our return. This little cutout is the bottom, so that's the return. So you need to make sure the return on the case is cleaned out. So there's a bigger hole right here on this side of the case. That's the oil return. So look at yours really closely. Make sure that return is cleaned out. And when you go to put this on with your gasket and silicone, I'm going to use black RTV. That's how I'm going to put mine on. The return goes to the bottom. Then obviously this is the hook for the spring here. That is the top. Alright, so I put silicone on both sides. I'm going to have silicone on here and on there. And I have my gasket that matches in between. The gasket has a cutout for that oil return, so make sure you line that up. Fairly simple. what's even more important is making sure you didn't clog the hole for the oil return when you put your silicone on. Now I'm going to go ahead and mate it up. Now one thing you have to know in this step of the process is that these bolt holes are not blind holes. You can get an oil leak from one of these bolt holes. So each one of these bolts that I'm putting in is going to get Permatex thread sealant on it. This is the part of the process where everything's going to get a little goopy, a little bit messy. I'd rather have a little extra Permatex sticking out the sides or a little extra silicone squeezed out the sides than an oil leak flinging all over your clutch. Now that we're to this point, it's time to set it end on end and finish this assembly. Now this bearing is probably going to have to be heated as well. Let's see. It's just a hair tight. These machine tolerances. This output shaft is over 80 years old. This bearing is probably a year old, 2 years old, just sitting in a box somewhere. The tolerance is a little bit different. Just heating these up. They usually slide on pretty simple. After we get this output shaft on, that actually puts, after we get this output shaft bearing on, that actually puts everything where it's supposed to be, and we can get our counter shaft and get that officially in place next. Okay, so I ran into something else new for me. Great for you guys, bad for me. Keep running into weird situations. This ring, this C-clip on both bearing surfaces need to sit flat onto the case. The one in the front sit flat on the case. I flip the case over to set it down and put this back seal on, and this ring didn't sit flush, and it ends up that this is the old one, so I compared the old one to the new one. That's why it's always good to have your old parts sitting on the bench still when you're rebuilding it. But on the new Synchronizer, this tab here, so this little cutout tab here, was too tall. This too tall pushed that whole output shaft up, or further out the output shaft. So I had to take it all the way back apart, and I ground these notches down until they were no longer in contact with little detents on the Synchronizer block. That Synchronizer block would come down and sit into that notch. I showed you that earlier when we were assembling it. The notch was too tall on the replacement Synchronizer. Once I ground it down, this came down far enough and finally touched the case. So this has to touch the case on both sides because that ring pushes against this, or this pushes against that ring, and that's how it'll sit flush on the case. Now obviously it goes like that, but just so you know, watch out for some weird stuff like that with replacement parts. Now that being said, I can move on. I'll probably just edit all that extra out later because these videos get way too long. So now we have a seal that goes here. We have a bunch of bolts that are not blind. So when we go to bolt this in, make sure you put Permatex on it. Put your silicone on both sides, both surfaces, and the gasket in between. It'll all mash itself up and seal great. Now on these, they do have top and bottom. It's pretty easy to see. The rubber biscuit will not fit here because it's cut out. The rubber biscuit will fit here because of this cutout. So take a look at yours and make sure you don't put it on upside down. Now make sure you put on the pin for the counter shaft before you put on the rear mount. Awesome, now we practically have this thing fully assembled. Two things are left. You need to degrease these pins here that holds the reverse and the counter shaft. Degrease them, put silicone bead around them, get real nasty with it and just leave it. It's one of those things, do you want it to look pretty or do you want it to seal? I want it to seal because this thing's going to be driving all over the country, so I'm going to slop some silicone around here on these shafts, on the front too, in here. I don't want to do it right now in the video because I actually want to wait for my silicone to completely dry on this end and this end before I start putting any kind of degreases on anything. I don't want to mess up my silicone. Now, I'm also going to put my clutch shaft back in. This is the original shaft. It cleaned up very nicely. I'm happy with it. Something else you might be noting, there are brass bushings right here that holds the clutch shaft. Those are very easy to push out. They're very easy to replace. They don't always need to be replaced. And in your rebuild kit, they do not come with the rebuild kit. That's a situation type fix and something that you really can't do in the car. So it's up to you if you want to do it while it's out. If you're going to replace these, make sure you order them. They do not come in the rebuild kit. Now as far as assembly, this is finished. Just need to line up the forks, put the cover back on, put that on with silicone so it seals up really nicely. I actually fill these completely full before I put on the side shift. You can also fill it up later while it is in the car if you'd like, just in case you're worried about making any type of mess. It is actually really easy to get to, so don't worry about will you be able to get to it or not. I like to do it so I can pour the oil, I can pour the grease oil all over in certain areas that I want it to be shifted around right here by hand before I put the cover back on. That's how I like to do it. Last but not least, we have to put the throwout bearing onto the little throwout bearing hub. When you buy the throwout bearing, it does not come on the hub. You have to press it off. Now I haven't cleaned this up yet. This is what it used to look like before I took it apart. But that's the hub there. But that's the hub there on the back right there. Here's our replacement bearing that does not come in the rebuild kit. You need to order this individually. Very simple. It pushes off the back of this hub, pushes back on. You might have to heat it up a tad, but I don't really like to heat up throwout bearings because they're so important. What you need to know, I'm not going to film it because I don't want to bore you to death, but what you need to know about pushing this back on is the smooth side goes towards the clutch. This side with the step goes towards the transmission. So don't put that on backwards, otherwise this will work terribly and probably blow up your clutch probably because this side doesn't spin. So make sure you pay attention to that when you're taking it off, put it back on. Very simple. I also put transmission assembly grease in here inside of the throwout bearing hub, so when it slides on and off that or back and forth on that shaft, it slides very easily, very smoothly. All we have to do now is take this car for a spin, test this out. I'm very excited. I've been waiting. I've done a lot to this 47 Ford Coupe, so I'm very excited to drive it. I want to thank you guys for watching my channel. Please like, share, subscribe. That helps me out a lot. If you want to buy shirts, just ask for one. Now stop watching this video, get out in the garage, and get your shift together.